Hey everybody, Marcus here. Now I'm confident that you've heard of film noir before. This is a label bestowed by French film critics for a flavor of movies that emerged out of Hollywood between 1941 and 1958. Scholars of the genre, and yes, apparently there are scholars of this genre, and including philosophers actually, they generally agree that The Maltese Falcon, starring Humphrey Bogart, is the first official film noir to have been made. The last of the chain is said to be Orson Welles' Touch of Evil in 1958. Now, Humphrey Bogart, for all intents and purposes, built his career on starring in noirs. He, as a character and as a person, is also the quintessential manly man, competent, cunning, attractive, stylishly dressed, but at the same time not a cartoon character like the bodybuilder action heroes of the 1980s. So Bogart, if boiled down to a single adjective, is a classy man, yet at the same time an everyman. The characters he portrays tend to be, well, down to earth, common folk, whether a business owner, a detective, or an ex soldier. His characters are quite approachable. They give off that, yeah, I could have ended up as that guy sort of vibe. The whole genre of noir is, well, quite MGTOW down to the core. Until I started to deep dive into the subject, conceptually though, film noir existed in my mind as no more than a set of black and white films. The high contrast color scheme did not register with me. Neither did the use of shadows, oblique camera angles, voiceovers, and non-linear storytelling. All of that was basically completely invisible. Simply put, to me, film noir was no more than, well, a fancy label with which old black and white movies were used to refer to. However, now that I've spent some time with the genre, it's obvious that there's a lot going on in noirs. To my surprise, that which is going on is not really any different from what was going on in the Manosphere for the last 15 years. Film noirs have been labeled by film critics as fundamentally male films, specifically films depicting male nightmares. The main character is always a man. Almost always is that man an everyday Joe. And there are women in these films, of course, and they're never the main character. Also, women are never portrayed in a positive way. There are no positive female role models in noirs. And these women, well, they always get what's coming to them. The dominant role of the woman in noir is that of the femme fatale. The femme fatale is labeled as such because, well, she leads a man to a bad end. Typically to his death, actually. And she does this by using her sexuality to seduce a hapless everyman with a hidden agenda. A common narrative is that which appears in, say, the movie Double Indemnity. Now, if you're to watch any single one noir film, watch Double Indemnity, as it contains pretty much every film trope from the noir genre imaginable, and it also pioneered one of the now common film motifs of a voiceover. Now, in Double Indemnity, an insurance salesman is seduced by the wife of a wealthy man. Her objective was to convince the salesman to murder her husband so that she could cash in on his life insurance policy. The title of Double Indemnity points to a clause in the insurance policy that doubles the money rewarded if the death occurs in a statistically rare way. Now, not really surprisingly, this of course ends very badly for our insurance salesman. He ends up being caught and sentenced to death by the state. The movie takes place as a series of flashbacks recounted by the man from his prison cell, confessing to the crime as he awaits death. And yes, flashbacks were pioneered by film noir. Prior to noir, movies were told sequentially, and this trend was broken by noir. Now, they're pretty much everywhere. The femme fatale is not the only role of a woman in these movies. Often, the woman is an object of conflict between men. Though the woman herself is not manipulating the men in such plots as such, her very existence ultimately is causal in the problems that these men face. Now, the messaging is that putting a woman ahead of logic will also spell your doom. In general, these movies often showcase how nothing good can come from centering a woman in your decision making. Now, I don't know how much more MGTOW this messaging could get, really. The male protagonists, by necessity, are unfortunately blue pillars, but we can understand that. Yet, the narratives play out as if they were written by a red pillar. Noirs are crime films. They belong as a subcategory of crime dramas. They superseded the gangster films of the 1930s. Now, noirs tell a different story from a typical gangster film, though. Whereas in gangster films, the crimes are committed by criminals, in noir, the crimes are committed by everyday people. Now, this is another theme of these movies. Namely, how can a normal, law-abiding citizen be brought to the point of committing a crime? The answer is often, well, because of a woman. Not always. Sometimes it's greed, but usually it's because of a woman. Also, ambiguity litters the genre. The characters cannot exactly be painted as either good or evil. Like Stardust likes to paint the human condition, for example. They're just monkeys, and we need to be honest about what people really are like as opposed to the idealized version we like to imagine ourselves as. Characters in noir are portrayed not in the modern sense of fully fleshed out individuals, but more as a process. The human condition, after all, is an ongoing thing throughout life. Man is an ever-changing creature from moment to moment, and as such, his character too is changing through time. It is not controversial to say, for example, a person's values change during his lifetime, and this means there must be a specific point in time during which one value changes to another. And noir attempts to capture that moment. It shows the events that lead to these value changes and the consequences, but in a very compressed manner. As such, the characters tend to be quite ambiguous. Sometimes they may behave from a pure and good motivation, while a second later, they do or say something that may come across as evil. It is not the case that the characters are inconsistent because of this. It is the case that, well, a movie has only 90 minutes to showcase the breadth of moral dilemmas that face a person throughout life. So, the reasons are always rational, but this is part of the beauty of how noir portrays characters. The logical reasoning for either a good or bad act, it kind of makes sense. Sure, it may sometimes be a somewhat primitive form of reasoning, but it's reasoning nonetheless. This reasoning is put into place to make sure that the characters are not perceived to be acting out of pure passion. Indeed, the characters are acting through reason, even if flawed. Yet, this moral ambiguity is only one part of the blanket of pessimism that covers the genre. Noir is thematically Schopenhauerian pessimism, a pessimism not surprising to have appeared in these films given, well, the context in which they were made. Now remember, the first noir is The Maltese Falcon of 1941. This is during the Second World War. Okay, let's think about this. Jews, among, well, German Jews, were fleeing Europe and heading to America in the 1930s. We can imagine why. And those German Jews that were in show business who fled Europe at the time inevitably made it into Hollywood. With them, they brought the German pessimism and also the artistic sense. The visuals of noir originated from German expressionism. So too, the pessimism comes from, well, German philosophy. And today, the sentiment on the internet, as we can see, is the black pill. It's a poisoned extreme form of German pessimism. I would call it Philip Mainlander grade pessimism. And Mainlander's philosophy is Schopenhauerian in nature, but ramped up to 11. I would call Mainlander really a, well, proto-black pillar philosopher. I don't really talk about him much on my channel, as in I have never spoken about him on my channel, because honestly, he's kind of weak for a philosopher, but he is a hardcore version extreme of that Schopenhauerian Nietzschean time frame. Mainlander was heavily influenced by Schopenhauer, but then he went off on crazy tangents. But back to noir. To understand the philosophy of noir, we must broach the subject of God, because always God appears somewhere. What was film noir attempting to actually do? Well, it was trying to battle nihilism. You see, after the proclamation of the death of God in the 19th century, well, as Nietzsche predicted, many were thrown into nihilism. Ideology replaced religion, and the inevitable wars Nietzsche predicted had already been well underway. World War I ravaged Europe from 1914 to 1918. The Bolsheviks instilled socialism in Russia starting with the 1917 Russian Revolution, and Tsarist Russia consequent ended with the brutal murder of the Romanov family in 1918, of which, well, Nicholas II was the last Russian emperor. And then we had the Weimar Republic, which ended with Hitler, and basically all of the 1930s were a build-up to World War II. And as for the US, we also had the Great Depression starting from 1929. Now, there was a lot to be pessimistic about in those years leading up to the first film noirs. However, the whole backdrop is painted against the death of God. If God does not exist, then there is nothing grounding moral values, nor is there meaning or purpose or direction to human existence. Now that's some heavy stuff to sort out. How are people supposed to behave given that backdrop? What are they supposed to believe in? What are their decisions meant to be based on? These are the questions that Noir was exploring and attempting to answer. This is why the characters were ambiguous. They had no moral anchor in religion. Even if these characters purported to be of faith, it was only one of tradition as opposed to actual conviction. They would go through the motions of faith, well, with none of the convictions of faith. Stripped of the protective religious view, man was left metaphysically naked. The philosophy of William James was gaining mainstream traction in the early 20th century as well. Now, William James was an American philosopher and psychologist who advocated for a theory of pragmatism as a new ethical model of human conduct. And this pragmatism underpins the reasoning of the characters in Noir, most of them at least, given as the justification of their actions. And we see a lot of that even today, when people reach to expediency as an explanation of why they did what they did. Film noir was the beginning of the end of American optimism. American exceptionalism had fueled a form of optimism that was unique and distinct in the West up to that point. However, the events of the 20th century had weighed heavy on the country, and eventually, well, it snapped with World War II. Americans began to descend into pessimism, and the post-war era can be described as basically a transvaluation of values, pretty much like Nietzsche predicted. America to this day is still suffering from the death of God, pretty much like everywhere else. So film noir, as we can see, is a pretty deep genre of movies, and countless books have been written on the subject. It is a genre still relevant and loved through the neo-noir tradition that's been produced since the 1960s. So movies like Fight Club, Pulp Fiction, Taxi Driver, Drive, and of course the more recent but first manifestation of Joker. In fact, pretty much every Quentin Tarantino movie is a neo-noir, and these movies do connect with people. They connect because the consequences of the death of God are still raging around us. So, there's a lot more I could say on this subject, but I'll start to wrap this up for now. And I recommend to you to check out Double Indemnity or The Maltese Falcon if you've never seen a neo-noir or noir movie of any sort before, and you really want to get kind of the best of the the original series, as we can say, in the Star Trek sense, the 1940s to 1960s series. Try one of those. Also, if you are interested, I made a 1-minute short noir film on my other channel. And it's kind of my first dive into virtual production, as in I made the scene in Unreal Engine and then injected myself into it via a green screen. And it kind of turned out not bad at all. And noir in general seems to be the direction I'm going to be heading in with my filmmaking and music. All my artistic productions, by the way, will be on my other channel, and the link is in the description. The general plan is really to kind of unify the different branches of my activities of the music, the MGTOW, the philosophy into one coherent picture, and it seems to have landed on a noir theme, which is completely unexpected for me. Yeah, so if you're interested in following any of my other works, then check out the other channel. And if you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, well, the link is somewhere in the description. And I'd like to thank Flapjack for being, I guess, my first patron back since I came back. Thank you, Flapjack. Yeah, thanks for listening. Go team.